I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Sherrone Moore case. These are my speculations. What happens when rejection pushes someone to the edge of self-destruction? In cases like this, suicidal threats often signal deep emotional turmoil, perhaps rooted in unresolved attachment issues. This behavior can reveal a pattern where control slips away, leading to desperate acts. Stick with me as we explore the evidence that shows how hidden relationships can unravel into public crisis. On January 23, 2026, defense attorneys for Sherrone Moore filed a motion to dismiss all charges against him. They argue the accusation stemmed from a staff member's attempt to secure a financial settlement from the University of Michigan. This latest move came after a court appearance where Moore appeared with his wife. The judge set a hearing for the motion in February, while adjourning the probable cause conference in March. These developments highlight ongoing disputes over credibility and motives. Prosecutors maintained the charges based on witness statements and police reports. Moore, once the head football coach at Michigan, faces felony counts of third-degree home invasion and 2 misdemeanors, stalking and breaking and entering. He entered a not guilty plea on his arraignment. As we look back, the events began unfolding rapidly in December 2025. The university fired Moore on December 10 for violating policies on relationships with staff and for providing false information during an internal probe. And hours after his termination, police arrested him at the home of the woman involved. Reports indicate he entered her apartment without permission that evening. The woman, an executive assistant in a football program, had ended their relationships 2 days prior. According to court documents, Moore arrived unannounced, leading to a confrontation. During the incident, he allegedly grabbed a butter knives from the drawer and pointed them toward her. He also made statements about his blood being on her hands, interpreted as a suicide threat. From a mental health perspective, such threats often point to intense emotional distress. They might stem from feelings of abandonment, where the end of a close bond feels like the total loss of self-worth. Why would someone in such a position of power escalate to this? It could tie into a patterns of dependency where relationships become anchors for identity. Police arrived after the woman's attorney called dispatch, reporting an attack. Officers found Moore inside the residence, and he complied with their commands. He admitted to the affair, but denied any threats or violence. This discrepancy raises questions about perception in high-stress moments. What drives denial in the face of accusations? Psychologically, it might reflect cognitive dissonance, where admitting fault clashes with one's self-image as a leader. The affair reportedly lasted around 2 years, which violated university rules which were implemented in 2021, which prohibit romantic involvements between coaches and subordinates. Moore, married at the time, kept the relationship secret. This secrecy could indicate compartmentalization, a coping mechanism where conflicting parts of life stay separated to avoid guilt. But when exposed, that barrier crumbles. The psychological strain of living a double life often builds pressure, leading to impulsive decisions. Have you ever considered how hidden deceptions erode mental stability over time? In therapy, I see clients struggle with the weight of secrets, which can manifest as anxiety or erratic behavior. The woman told investigators she felt terrified during the encounter. She described Moore banging on her door before entering through an unlocked entry. Once inside, he confronted her about the breakup and her role in the firing. Records show he accused her of ruining his life. This reaction might suggest entitlement, a trait sometimes linked to positions of authority. When success defines someone, threats to that status can trigger defensive aggression. Yet aggression here appeared inward too, with the suicide reference. That blend of outward blame and self-harm hints at mixed emotional states, possibly depression intertwined with anger. Moore's defense team has challenged the woman's account. They claim she seeks financial gain, pointing to her potential lawsuit against the university. In court filings, they requested her phone records to examine communication, and this strategy aims to question her credibility. Psychologically, disputes over truth in relationships often reveal trust erosion, where one party feels betrayed. It can lead to obsessive rumination, replaying events to regain control. Why do some overfixate on past connections? It might connect to attachment styles formed in early life, though we lack details on Moore's background. Public records showed no prior criminal history for Moore, and he built a career from player to coach, rising to head coach after the former coach's departure in 2024. His success, including leading Michigan to a national championship as an interim coach, this rapid ascent might foster a sense of invincibility. Psychologically speaking, overconfidence can blind individuals to risk. As I analyze cases, I notice how achievements sometimes mask vulnerabilities, like the fear of failure. The plan to confront her seemed impulsive, given the timing right after his firing. This appears to be another example of the timeless strategy of attempting to outsmart investigators who literally do this for a living. But impulses often override logic in emotional crisis. Mental health indicators here include poor impulse control, possibly exacerbated by stress. Court testimony from a detective described the woman's fear. She locked herself in a bathroom during the call to her lawyer. Her attorney alleged a history of domestic violence in their relationship. This claim, if substantiated, will point to a pattern of coercive control. Coercion in relationships can stem from insecurity, and people with such traits might use manipulation to maintain bonds, fearing solitude. Have you thought about how fear of loneliness drives harmful choices? In counseling, addressing this root can prevent escalation. Moore's team disputes the violence history. They portray the incident as a consensual visit gone wrong, not a break-in. This narrative clash underscores selective memory, a psychological bias where events align with one's viewpoint. The university's investigation revealed Moore lied about the relationship. He initially denied it, then admitted partial truths. Lying under pressure might indicate avoidance coping, and instead of facing consequences, denial delays the inevitable. But delays can amplify problems too. Psychologically, this avoidance often links to anxiety disorders where confrontation feels overwhelming. Following his arrest, Moore spent 2 nights in custody before being released on bond. Conditions include no contact with the woman and GPS monitoring. These restrictions can heighten feelings of isolation. For someone used to team environments, solitude might intensify introspection or regret. What role does regret play in behavioral change? In my practice, it's a catalyst, but only if paired with accountability. Media coverage has focused on the scandal's impact on Michigan football, and the program faced prior controversies, like sign-stealing allegations in 2023. Moore was implicated on deleting texts related to the probe. The NCAA issued a notice of allegations in August of 2025, citing recruiting violations too. Though separate, these events compound stress. Chronic stress can impair judgment, leading to a cascade of poor decisions. Psychologically, accumulated pressures might explain the buildup to December 10th. It's like a pressure cooker, where small leaks turn into explosions. The woman's statements detail months of stalking behavior. She reported unwanted contacts leading up to the breakup. Stalking often arises from obsession, a mental health red flag tied to rejection sensitivity. Sufferers perceive breakups as personal attacks. Why does rejection sting so deeply for some and not for others? Well, it can echo past experiences of loss. It amplifies current pain. Court documents quote Moore's messages post-breakup. They show pleas for reconciliation mixed with accusations. This ambivalence, love, and resentment suggests emotional dysregulation. Swing between extremes can indicate borderline traits, though speculation only here. In therapy, regulating emotions prevents such volatility. Without the tools, conflicts will escalate. Have you ever pondered why some cling to toxic bonds? It might stem from low self-esteem, where any connection feels better than none. Moore's wife attended his court hearings. Her presence raises questions about family dynamics under public scrutiny. Supporting a partner through accusations can strain mental health. Feelings of betrayal might lead to trust issues for all involved. The victim's perspective deserves respect here as well. Her reported terror highlights trauma's lasting effects. Victims of stalking often experience hypervigilance. This state of constant alert can develop into PTSD symptoms. As the case progresses, new evidence might emerge. The February hearing on dismissal could pivot everything. If dismissed, it might validate Moore's innocence claim. If not, the trial could reveal more communications. Psychologically, uncertainty prolongs anxiety for everyone. Resolution brings closure and allowing healing, but healing requires acknowledgement. Another red flag here is the alleged knife incident. Pointing utensils, even butter knives, signals intimidation tactics often mask vulnerability. Perpetrators use them to regain power when feeling powerless. Have you considered how power imbalances in workplaces fuel such dynamics? Authority figures might exploit positions, leading to entitlement. The affair began around 2023. It coincided with Moore's promotion to offensive coordinator. Success can inflate ego, reducing empathy. The university cited policy violations from 2021. These rules aim to prevent exploitation. Ignoring them suggests risk-taking behavior. Thrill-seeking can overlap with impulsivity, which is a common mental health concern. Moore's post-firing actions seem reactive. Losing his job stripped his identity, possibly triggering a crisis. Identity loss can lead to despair, and in counseling, rebuilding self beyond career is key. The digital footprint in this case was enthusiastic. Texts and calls documented the stalking claims. But why leave traces? It might reflect a disregard for consequences or a simply emotional override. As I reflect, this case shows how unchecked emotions derail lives. The explanation offered was imaginative, if not particularly persuasive. Moore claimed he was invited, but evidence suggests otherwise. Disputes like this often boil down to he said, she said. Psychologically, truth-seeking involves examining the patterns. Patterns here include secrecy, confrontation, and denial. They point to deeper issues with boundaries. Have you ever wondered why boundaries crumble under pressure? Often it's from unaddressed needs for validation. The woman's lawyer claimed ongoing abuse, and if true, it indicates a cycle: tension, incident, and reconciliation. Breaking cycles requires intervention. Without it, behaviors will repeat. Moore's clean record prior suggests this was situational. Stressors like job loss can unmask latent issues. But situations don't excuse actions. Accountability matters, especially for a leader. As someone who spends far too much time thinking about these cases, even I found this twist surprising. A coach's fall from grace underscores fragility. Moving forward, therapy could help process emotions. For anyone involved, professional support will aid in that recovery. The case also touches on institutional responsibility. Universities must enforce policies to protect staff. Psychologically safe environments will reduce power abuses like this. What if early signs were spotted? Red flags like intense pursuits might have prompted help. In my analysis, motives tie to loss aversion. People will fight harder to keep what they have than to try to gain something new. This will drive desperate acts. Understanding this helps emphasize without excusing. The alibi for the entry turned out to be less than airtight. Claims of permission conflict with locked doors. Such inconsistencies might stem from panic. Under stress, the stories will shift. If charges hold, rehabilitation focuses on empathy training. This case illustrates the classic mismatch between perceived cleverness and actual detectability. Entering a home post-firing invites scrutiny here. The current status of this case is that charges are still pending, with motions filed to dismiss. This analysis highlights red flags like emotional volatility, secrecy, and control needs. They weave through the backstory of a hidden affair exploding into crisis. Moore is used to being in the public eye. Obviously, football was his passion. He loved it. But unfortunately, he loved something else, and that was the affair, the secrecy behind closed doors. He knew it was in contrast to the rules of the university, and yet he chose to do it anyway. So that level of deception, not just with the university, with the players, with his wife and other family and friends, he chose that secret life. Many people do. There's a thrill that can come from that without really understanding or thinking about the consequences after fact. And so this is a very public case. Moore is in the public eye again, but not the way he wants it to be. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.